Welcome to the Capitol Conversation, sponsored by Colorado Politics, the Denver Gazette, and 9 News, where we're going to be setting up the resumption of the 73rd General Assembly. I am Linda Shapley, Managing Editor of Colorado Politics, and I am pleased to introduce you to our panelists today. So Senate Minority Leader Chris Holbert represents Senate District 30, which includes Parker. He has been the Republican leader of the Senate since 2017. We have a last minute adjustment. Senate Majority Leader Steve Fenberg is filling in for Senate President Leroy Garcia. Fenberg represents Senate District 18, including Boulder. He has been the Majority Leader since 2019. So we have new leadership on both sides of the aisle in the House. Speaker of the House, Alec Garnett, now in his 4th and final term, represents the Capitol Hill-based House District 2. The House Minority Leader is Hugh McKean. He represents House District 51, which includes the city of Loveland. So thank you all for being here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start off with a video introduction from Jared Polis. Please hold.
And small businesses that were hit hard in the pandemic. I also want to congratulate our incoming legislators and look forward to working with them, getting to know the new ones, and making transformational change, getting to the root of the issues we've long grappled with. You know, in the past, these events have been so loud and raucous, I don't think anybody could even hear what anybody had to say. So at least the people watching this today can hear me, unless your kids are screaming in the background, which might be the case for some of you. Happens to me too. Our kids are 9 and 6. We have a once in a generation opportunity right now to not just build back, but build back stronger than where we were before the pandemic, to fundamentally reimagine Colorado's future post-pandemic, a future where all Coloradans can thrive. We're not out of the woods of COVID yet, but we're close. We're in the final weeks and months. And that's what makes this coming legislative session the most important in recent history. We can lay a groundwork for Colorado's rapid recovery, of course, creating jobs, enhancing opportunities for entrepreneurs, help for small businesses, relief for families that have lost income. You know, even before the pandemic, frankly, too many Coloradans were being left behind, but we now have a chance to build back in a way that works better for people for whom the status quo didn't work well even before the pandemic. With strategic one-time investments, we can jumpstart our small businesses, our recovery, jobs, minority-owned businesses, modernize broadband, connect tens of thousands of people to high-speed internet, make communities across the state more livable, make our park system the envy of the nation for our own enjoyment here and to attract tourists from abroad. You know, of course, in Colorado, our pocketbook isn't as large as Congress's, but you know what? We know Colorado, and we can target investments so they have the greatest return for Colorado. That's why we're proposing $130 million in shovel-ready infrastructure, roads, getting Coloradans back to work, and setting up our success in the long run by decreasing traffic. We're building on broadband. During the special session, we have some funding and an additional proposal for $120 million to connect more Coloradans. And we're excited to invest in the people of Colorado, our greatest asset, with a $40 million for upskilling to help those in need get retrained, reskilled, feel good jobs, you know, out of the minimum wage economy into the professional salaried economy with the skills they need to help themselves and their families, and to help Colorado's economy thrive. We can and we must bring down the cost of healthcare insurance and the cost of prescription drugs, because people shouldn't have to choose between medicine or buying your family dinner or paying your rent. And finally, we want to continue to build on the success of the past few years on keeping Colorado on the road to 100% renewable energy by 2040. And there's a lot of great items we're working on, and we look forward to partnering with the legislature to create good green jobs, save consumers money, and better prepare Colorado to win the future. These are just a few of the items. There's a lot more. You're going to hear more in the upcoming State of the State address, but this is some of the key items that I think we need to accomplish. Really, by and large, the single biggest thing is to grasp the opportunity of this unique moment in time to build an even more amazing Colorado with transformational one-time investments to pay dividends for our lifetimes, our kids' lifetimes, and our grandkids' lifetimes. Look, the task ahead is great, but our commitment to meeting this moment and creating a future worthy of Colorado is even greater. I look forward to working together with Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature to take these important steps for Colorado this session. It's an honor to join you today, and thank you.
All right. Thanks so much to the governor for his comments. So our discussion will be moderated by Colorado Politics senior writer Joey Bunch and 9 News political reporter Marshall Zellinger. We've already received a ton of great questions, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. But if you have more, use the chat feature to ask your question. Chief Legislative Reporter Marianne Goodland will be monitoring the feed. So Marshall and Joey, take it away.
Thanks so much. Before we get started, I feel like I need to ask if Minority Leader McKean needs us to send help immediately to his location.
You have to remember that some of us actually do work other than the stuff we do at the Capitol. So I just successfully passed a basement inspection, and I needed to be here for that. So no, well, help would help. Yeah, people can hang drywall. I don't mind.
Good to know. The way this is going to work, we're not on second reading on the floor where we're going to filibuster for a while. We ask that you keep your answers to 60 seconds. Linda does have the ability to mute. We don't want to use it, but we want to get through as much as possible and to get to as much content as we can. I'm going to begin with a question for the Democratic leadership, and I think I'll go to Speaker Garnett to answer this first, followed by Majority Leader Fenberg. This question is the perception that the governor has been legislating for a year now. And it's not just a perception. He has signed 50 or so executive orders with about 300 that extend those executive orders. I'm sure that the Democratic leadership has been working behind the scenes to help craft some of these. That's probably inside baseball, though, and the public only sees that the governor seems to be legislating. So why have you allowed the governor to be the executive branch and the legislative branch for almost a year now?
Well, first, Marshall, thanks for the question. Thanks for setting this up and the invite. It's an honor to be here. I look forward to this discussion with Majority Leader Fenberg and Minority Leader Holbert and McKean. It's exciting that we are going to be back on Tuesday. I think to your question specifically, Marshall, is no one planned to go into a year-long global pandemic the way that we found ourselves today. No one campaigned on this in 2018 when people were running for office. And clearly, as we went into this crisis last year, the nation wasn't prepared. And the state of Colorado had never seen anything like this before. So when we went into the pandemic, we worked in a bipartisan way to figure out, should we go into a temporary adjournment for the legislature? What rules and tools are in place for us to address the safety of the public? And what was clear was that the legislative process is such a people-to-people business. We're constantly talking to people from across the aisle, talking to the people who are coming in the building, advocating on behalf of one issue or another. But we have a citizen legislature. We are only allowed to be in session for 120 days. And the amount of change that had to go in place in order to handle this pandemic couldn't get done when we were not in, had to get done even though we weren't in session. So I actually really compliment the leadership that Governor Polis has shown over time to try to meet the needs. Restaurants, for example, how can we help restaurants in the immediate term as they're facing massive layoffs and big revenue shortfalls? Well, the legislature wasn't in session. We weren't able to pass a bill, but the governor was able to pass an executive order to allow for liquor to be taken off premise. These were the types of things that we needed the flexibility to do. The governor had to do it. And I think for the most part, we have tried to navigate this in the best way possible, and Colorado finds itself in a better place than most states.
Senator Fenberg, let me switch it to you and just craft the question slightly different. You can still address what I've asked so far, but the idea that the legislature is essentially doing the governor's bidding. Whatever he asks will get done because he's already made executive orders about it.
Well, it sure doesn't feel that way with the debates and conversations we have as a caucus and as a chamber. If we were just doing his bidding, I think we could all save a whole lot of time and just do his bidding, which I feel like we're very much not doing. We are. I mean, look, to your original question, I think this would be a very different situation if the governor was like, great, there's a public health emergency. I have increased powers. Let's see what kind of political things I can get done in this moment. And if he started doing things like healthcare reform or major initiatives that he's been wanting to do with these emergency powers that he has in an emergency, that would be different. But I don't think anybody is really claiming that he's abusing his power. I think some people just disagree with some of the decisions he's made around the public health crisis. I think he's doing what our Constitution and our statutes provide for in this moment in time, because we have a crisis. It was and is still urgent. And it's important that there's someone who's listening to the scientists, to the public health officials, and making informed decisions on a daily basis based on those. We will be back in session on Tuesday. We have the opportunity to reverse some of his decisions or reinforce some of the other ones or go in a totally different direction. And those are the debates that we are going to have as a legislature. But I think, generally speaking, what he has done has been in concert or in consultation with legislative leadership, and has been based on his belief that he's following the science and the experts to look out for the health and the economic well-being of all Coloradans.
Well, let me address a question to the Republicans, and I'll address it to Representative McKean, and then allow Senator Holbert to come in and clean up Representative McKean or the Democrats, whatever he wishes. The Republicans have a different set of problems than the Democrats. They have deep fissures, both locally and nationally. So, how do you legislate effectively when you've got members who have deep concerns about the January 6th insurrection, and you have members who have deep concerns over election fraud? How do you manage that? How do you speak with one voice when we don't know what Republicans are saying anymore? Representative McKean?
I unmute myself. I think it's interesting that you suggest that Senator Holbert is going to come back clean up, but that's fine. He has to do that a lot. But what I would tell you is that I think that we're way more unified than it might appear. I think that there are fundamental things that join Republicans together and would have me tell you I'm proud to be a Republican. I believe that government is instituted to protect individual rights, individual liberties. That's a really big thing. I believe that we think that government should be as small as possible. Now, my friend Steve Johnson up here in Larimer County says government should never do what's in the yellow pages. We have to be incredibly transparent fiscally and make sure that people know where their money goes. We also have to champion the thing that drives off this entire engine, and that is free enterprise. But beyond that, everything else is just sort of window dressing to what we believe and how we go about our business and the way we look at government. And I think that that's actually really important to understand, that whatever small divisions we might have, there are core foundational beliefs that we hold as a body, as a group, that actually tie us together much more than anything splits us apart.
Senator Holbert, who's right? Is Representative McKean right, or the Democrats right? Oh, you still mute.
He says good stuff too. That was really good stuff right there.
Even this year.
I understand the quote of the year was you're on mute. So there we go. I disagree with Majority Leader Fenberg and Speaker Garnett, but I guess that's not surprising. Not interested in attacking Governor Polis relative to this current pandemic, this disaster emergency, but we collectively as Coloradans have 11 months of experience, soon to be a year of experience, that people who were responding, say, to 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, when they crafted the legislative rule, Joint Rule 44 or statutory authority, why shouldn't we have a discussion now with the 11 months of experience that we have from this past year and think about the future? Should the legislature be called back after 3 months or 6 months or at some point to review executive orders as we do with executive branch rules every year? We have a rule bill. So I guess we see that differently. I think we would be foolish not to have a discussion and look at what changes we might make based on the experiences that I think none of us had before 2020 and COVID-19. Relative to your question, Joey, about Republicans, I've had zero turnover in my staff, and we had one member of our leadership team change because our caucus whip was term limited and she left, and we elected a new caucus whip. Relative to the people who want to sort of classify all Democrats as being the same or all Republicans as being the same, the last time I was in Washington, D.C. was in the spring of 2008, 2 years before I ran and 3 years before I took office. Nothing about being a state senator in Colorado has anything to do with going to Washington, D.C., or in fact, working with the White House or Congress. That's the federal government. I've had the opportunity to be in the majority for 6 years, and if I stay, through the end of my term in 23, I'll be in the minority for 6 years. So I work with people like Steve Fenberg and Alec Garnett. Speaker Garnett. We wouldn't have had anything happen on construction defect legislation. We wouldn't have been able to move that ball at all if it hadn't been for him. So rather than talk about divisions with the former president or Congress, I want to give praise where it's due. I'm proud to work with Speaker Alec Garnett, and that's where I work. So I think the fissures that we have in our caucus are I think, non-existent, and the ability to work together, Republicans and Democrats here at the Capitol in Denver, not Congress in Washington, D.C., it's actually pretty good.
Now we want to get to some questions from the group and recorded questions we have, but I have one timely question. We learned, and I want to direct this, I hope this can be a quick answer to both our constitutional experts, Senator Holbert and Majority Leader Fenberg. With the news today that the U.S. Census Bureau may be way delayed with the data that we need for redistricting purposes, is there anything legislatively that can be done to adjust amendments Y and Z and the deadlines that voters put in the state constitution? Senator Holbert.
Well, first, I think we've got a bit of a Hail Mary built into Y and Z because at the end of the process, the only opportunity for a court to step in the process as defined is for the Supreme Court to look at it and ask or answer the question, was the required process followed? Could they answer that question earlier? Do they have to wait until the end? I think that gives us some hope. And if they can answer the question earlier, I think the legislature may look at interrogatory as an opportunity to ask the Supreme Court, what should we do? It's frustrating that the referral measures, the two concurrent resolutions, passed unanimously and passed with the voter support. It's frustrating. Here we are because something that's outside of our control is going to affect those deadlines, but I'm confident that it's going to work. And whether the state Supreme Court needs to weigh in earlier or later, I think that we're gonna be okay.
Senator Fenberg.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. So I was one of the original authors of Y and Z when we referred that, and it was a tough negotiation. I mean, that it's not every day that a redistricting reform bill gets unanimous support in a legislature, and so it's very challenging now and disappointing now to see that there is a wrench being thrown and that there's going to be a delay in the census data that we need in order to draw accurate maps So it's unfortunate. It's obviously beyond any of our control. But I think what we can say is that all of us, Republicans and Democrats alike, are committed to finding a path forward. I think Minority Leader Holbert raised a couple of options that we are discussing actively. But at the end of the day, whatever we do to move forward, the important thing is that I think we're all committed to honoring the intent of the voters when they passed Y and Z. And that means making sure it's independent, making sure it's a fair and transparent process that results in maps that represent our communities.
Thank you both. Our first crowdsourced question comes from John Caldera of the Independence Institute, and it will shock you to know what the topic is. Surprisingly, it's about paying for government with taxes or fees.
Do you want to throw this to any particular member, Marshall?
Well, you'll hear the question first, and then I will.
The legislature is always looking for more money. If you want to raise more money, you have to go to the people to raise taxes. That's in our Taxpayer Bill of Rights. But over the last decade or so, the legislature has gotten very good at increasing the revenues via increasing fees or creating new ones. Hospital provider fee, mill levy fees, faster fee, but not asking the voters. So angry were the voters about this that we passed Prop 117 just a few months ago to say you can't do it anymore. I'm hearing rumors that there might be a scheme afoot to raise existing fees to do something like a transportation tax. A fee. My question for all of you is, if you're going to raise an existing fee like that, will you go to the people first?
Speaker Garnett, it's not so much a rumor as I've done a story on the idea of different fees to help fund transportation. So I will direct Mr. Caldera's question to you first, Speaker Garnett.
Thanks, Marshall, and thanks, Caldera, for the question. I mean, listen, clearly there is a transportation problem here in Colorado. We have a backlog of projects that are hurting businesses in the state and that are, really having an impact on our economy. And, it's having an impact on the quality of life that Coloradans have, sitting in traffic and not being able to get to work and get up to the mountains that we all love. So, the transportation funding issue has been one that we have discussed for a decade in the legislature that, has stumped, Coloradans for more time than that. And so it certainly does feel to me like it's time to come together and try to figure out a funding package that maybe is different than what we've seen in the past, and different in terms of the size that we're talking about. So oftentimes when Coloradans try to, and either legislators or people outside the building try to conquer an unfunded or underfunded priority, what they do is they try to go after all of it all at once. And so I think what we need to do is come together and think about a practical, pragmatic approach to solving the transportation problem here. I mean, one of the big things that, for the reasons why we need to do it now, is because we're seeing a significant expansion in the road users and major changes in how that's impacting the infrastructure. And so there is going to be a discussion that goes on in the legislature. I think that everyone who's going to have it understands what the voters passed in 117, and everyone understands the impact of what a fee means, right? That it's directly proportional to the use, that whoever pays the fee has a direct benefit of what the fees are charged for, and that the user charge must apply equally to all users. We all understand that. No one's looking at going beyond those boundaries, but we need to all come together and figure this out, because this priority has missed so many other opportunities to get done.
I just guess I need a yes or no answer to his final question. If you're going to raise an existing fee, will you go to the people first?
We don't have to. 117 didn't say that you have to go to the voters if you raise an existing fee. It was all about whether or not you create a new enterprise that goes over a certain amount. So
I think he's saying, or if you're going to have a tax that you call a fee, are you going to go to the people first? Bottom line, are you going to go to the people and have them vote on this?
Listen, there's fees all over the place, whether or not that there's, the future of Colorado is going to be electric vehicles, right? So are we going to go to the voters and say, should we increase the electric vehicle registration fee by $10? No, we're not. That is not what 117 has asked. That's not what we've ever seen in the history in legislative past. we use fees just the way I described it to meet those needs.
I don't mean to skip over Minority Leader McKean, but Senator Holbert, you championed transportation recently in the Senate, and you have the closest margin to do something. How do you prevent a fee tax not going to the people?
The Democrats, if the majority party decides to raise a fee or potentially create a new fee, I hear reference to a gas tax fee, which would be a new one. If they do that legislatively, I will vote no. It's been decades since the gas tax has been raised, and I am skeptical about gas tax because more people are driving hybrids and electrics. That's probably not a long-term solution. But I've heard from conservatives here in Douglas County, where I live, who are asking why haven't they had an opportunity to vote on that question, raising the gas tax. Gas tax, state and federal, goes into the Highway Users Tax Fund. It doesn't come to the legislature. We don't appropriate it. And I like to throw out the last time the legislature in Colorado voted to approve a specific road or bridge occurred in 1899. It was a wagon road between Leadville and Pueblo. So we can look at how we raise more money, how we put more money into the CDOT coffers, or your county commissioners, town or city council members who do make the decisions as to what roads and bridges get built and fixed in your communities. But if more revenue is going to be generated by applying a fee to Uber and Lyft and meal delivery services, I will probably be a no on all of that as well. I think we should ask the voters. I think Mr. Caldero's premise is absolutely correct. The Taxpayers' Bill of Rights is in the Constitution because the people said they didn't want the legislature creating or raising tax rates. That decision gets to be made by the voters in Colorado, and calling something that really ought to be called a tax, calling it a fee, I guess we come up with a hybrid definition of a fax.
Well, guys,
No.
I've got a question about COVID. We're still very much under this. So, Senator Finberg, what are we going to do to ensure equal access to the legislators without actually being at the Capitol? How do we ensure people have access to the process?
Yeah, Joey, it's a good question. I mean, we've unfortunately been doing this for a year now, so we've learned some lessons, and we've had a little bit of practice. We are making changes, and the legislative process has evolved over the last year to make sure, and I think we've learned a lot, so we are going to implement a lot of these lessons learned. For instance, we're going to do everything we can to make the building as safe as possible. We're not shutting down the building. We never have in this process, but during this past year. But the building will be open. People, whether it's reporters, lobbyists, general public, will be allowed into the building. If they do, we'll ask them to follow basic safety protocol, like wearing masks and doing a temperature check when they enter the building. We're also going to be providing rapid tests several days a week for anybody who wants it as they come into the building. And we're going to be, implementing very basic safety protocols that all of us are unfortunately very familiar with in our daily lives already. So the answer is that we've made changes to make sure it's open, accessible, and safe. And for folks that don't feel safe coming in, we've created systems where they can testify in committee remotely. They can submit written testimony and things like that. So we're trying to keep all of the options there and then some, and do it in a way that keeps people safe.
Now, Representative McKean, you've got members who just adamantly won't wear a mask. Now, that seems at odds with what Senator Finberg said, and it seems at odds with people who might want to come to the Capitol and see their legislator if they have to worry about people who won't wear their mask. What do you do?
I think what you do is encourage people to give their compatriots the ability to represent their citizens, and do it in the best way possible. And all we can do is make that suggestion. People need to determine what is the best for them. And to be honest, that's what I tell my caucus is, anything I can do to make sure that my colleagues on either side of the aisle can come in and feel safe to be in the building, I do. And I think that that's a personal ethic that we follow through with. But since you skipped over me on other questions, I'm going to go back and I'm going to hog a little time here. Here's the issue that I think we have to really encapsulate what Mr. Caldera was talking about and what all of this other discussion has to do with. And it really ends up being a question of trust. And how much can people trust? It actually goes to what Senator Fenberg was just talking about. How much trust do the people have in their government? And I will tell you that some of the early articles during COVID, when other legislatures were still in session and participating in remote locations, and some legislatures actually went and set up shop in basketball arenas and other places. The Declaration of Independence actually says a few things about this. When King George was removing the colonies' legislatures to places where they were not familiar, where the public weren't familiar, where they didn't have the documents that they needed to do their job. I think we need to be really careful about that. And I think that this goes back to the whole transportation question, that we also need to make sure that we do nothing that breaks that contract of trust with our citizens, because our citizens did just tell us that it's really important for them to have input on fees and taxes. Yes, it is for new enterprises that are created that collect a certain amount. However, this trust issue goes to both ends of the two questions that we just heard. The trust issue of, can you go and appeal to your government in person? The other is, can we be assured that government is not going to do things that we just told them not to do, even if it's not quite that way, but it sounds that way? And I think that that's a really good place to have this discussion kind of center on transportation and other things, which is, how are we not just taking care of a transportation problem that's been building, that we really need to deal with in the short term, but how do we create a long-term relationship with the people of the state so they trust us to do what we say we're going to do it the way we're going to do it, and then make a tax or a fee go away at the end of that.
Minority Leader McKean learning how to debate early by going back to previous questions. Just want to point out that we've reached the Royal Rumble portion of this panel because our emergency backup with Majority Leader Fenberg, he had to jump off for a Zoom, so it's now 2-on-1. So thoughts and prayers to Speaker Garnett for the remainder of this panel. I'm going to toss to another video question here from Hannah Colazzo, the State Director of Environment, Colorado.
Colorado's leading source of greenhouse gas emissions comes from our transportation sector. We have an opportunity to build back better after COVID, and I think this is particularly relevant when it comes to our transportation system. What can we expect coming from the legislature in 2021 addressing our underfunded transportation system, and how is it going to reduce Colorado's greenhouse gas emissions?
I feel like the premise of the question starts with Speaker Garnett.
Thanks, Marshall, and thanks, Hannah. I'm sure you're tuning in for the question. Just for a quick second to go back to what Minority Leader McKean was saying, when it comes to building trust with the people of Colorado, there's no doubt that we all take that very, very seriously. And obviously, that trust is built on, when I look at who has that trust at the Capitol, it was kind of being insinuated that, somehow the Democrats might be, breaking down that trust. But what I see is a lot of trust that the people are giving the Democrats to really try to solve some of these big problems that are facing the state of Colorado. So I take the trust very seriously as well. And I honestly think that when it comes to the trust factor, that the Democrats actually have quite a bit of trust from the people across the state. I think when it comes to transportation, obviously we just touched on it a little bit. There's no doubt that the transportation future in every state, but especially here in Colorado, is different. And we talked a little bit about the electric vehicles and losing the dependence on the gas tax, because people are going to be driving more and more electric vehicles across the state of Colorado. Building out the transportation package needs to be able to build out the electrification infrastructure across the state to take into consideration those changes in behavior from the consumers and these market-driven decisions that are already happening. And then when it comes to additional things we can do, we want to make sure that the local governments that get a good chunk of the HUTF funding have the resources they need to move forward on multimodal options. The multimodal options have been proven in many other jurisdictions to help cut down on vehicle miles traveled and increase the quality of life for so many people. And that's the type of vision and future that we need to have as we try to build back stronger, not only in other parts of our economy, but when we think about the transportation system.
Minority Leader McKean, I guess I should start the question on this topic is your caucus interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
I think that that's a pretty simplistic question to what does it really mean? We have seen an incredible variety of fallacies over the last couple of years. Certainly at the beginning of COVID, we had this idea that the big brown cloud over Denver was somehow a product of ozone producing oil and gas production. Believe it or not, when the roads were empty of cars, the big brown cloud was gone. And so, yeah, we're interested in doing a lot of the things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But here's what I would like to get back to, and this is actually the way we address things. And Alec and I are good friends, so we can just say stuff out loud. I'm not actually disparaging the current Democrats of violating trust. What I'm suggesting is that the people of this state, back during faster fees, I mean, in my district, I still hear about people being upset with the increase in their vehicle registrations for faster fees, because it was a fee that got increased. Everybody saw it go up and dramatically doubled their registration fees. And so the challenge that we have is, how do you create a durable solution if what you're doing is saying, look, we know what's best right now and we're going to do this. And when we look at transit's a beautiful idea. The challenge, of course, is that when you look at the cost for the reduction in vehicle miles traveled, it often doesn't balance out. And so it's kind of a lofty goal and a lofty dream. And so what I'm saying is that really it's the basis of the question, which is, how do you engender trust? Not who has violated trust, but how do you engender trust with the people of this state to say that we will do what we say we're going to do? Back to Ms. Colasso's questions, I think that one of the things that we're really, really going to have to look at is the change in business. I mean, you now have people who are not going to leave their homes. Those are vehicle miles that are not going to get driven. You have people who will work from home because companies have figured out that they don't need a big commercial building to bring everybody to and to put in cubicles. And so I actually think that right now is a moment of good pause where we decide, what does the new world look like? Because whether we come out as a crisp end to the COVID-19 era or not, we are going to see an enormous change. Marshall, you are not at the Capitol interviewing us separately. You're in your home. Joey, I'm assuming that's your home. These are the new realities that I think we're going to have to embrace. And I think it actually changes the landscape for what greenhouse gas looks like, what transportation looks like, and what the new work environment looks like.
Well, let's stay on this subject of public health for a couple more questions. We got a lot of questions. I'm surprised by this. We got a lot of questions about the cost of prescription drugs, and not just that they're too high, but also we heard from people that are concerned about, whether price caps are going to affect innovation and research. So, Senator Holbert, you and I've had this conversation before. So let's start with you. What do you think about that? Where's the balance between controlling the cost of prescription drugs and hobbling an industry that's saving people's lives?
That is the point today. We have an industry that I think most of us, maybe all of us in the legislature, are grateful for the vaccinations that came with unprecedented speed. Price controls, if there is a board at the state level that sets price controls, some people might say, yay, we're going to pay less, or we won't be paying more. What that will mean, in my opinion, is that we won't have access to new drugs. They won't be created. At least it will be more difficult, more expensive, more challenging for pharmaceutical companies to create new drugs, as we've seen them do with the COVID vaccines. People who need specific drugs in Colorado, if there is a board for Colorado that is controlling prices, I don't think it'll be a surprise if suddenly a rare disease, a rare symptom, that a drug isn't available in Colorado. And we've seen people come to Colorado for cannabis-based medicine. I don't think over time it'll be surprising that people would be leaving Colorado to go to a state where they could access a particular pharmaceutical that they need for a family member. This sounds good, I guess, to some, but it hasn't worked. I'm not unaware of it working in any other state, and I'm confident it wouldn't work here. In recent years, we've heard a lot of talk from the majority about Canadian drug importation. I have literally heard a drug inspector from Canada warn us, they're not inspecting drugs that bounce through Canada when come to another country like the United States. And it makes me very concerned about the introduction of counterfeit drugs, particularly laced with fentanyl. That is happening, and I think that we need to stop holding on to populist messaging and things that sound good, and really think responsibly about the people of Colorado, making sure that we have access to pharmaceuticals. And I think the pharmaceutical industry understands that too. I think they're feeling the heat, just as, say, oil and gas did in Colorado. I would much rather work with the incredible innovators in the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that we have access to drugs when we need them.
Well, now, Representative Garnett, can you spread some wisdom on this, like mayonnaise on a tomato sandwich?
Wasn't there like a video that went viral of a U.S. senator putting too much mayonnaise on a sandwich? But regardless, listen, there's no doubt that there is the number one thing that we hear from Coloradans across the state is that healthcare costs are too high. People are desperate for us to figure out ways to help reduce healthcare costs, to help them save money on healthcare. And obviously prescription drugs is one of the concerns that I hear a lot about. I personally have had constituents call me and say, how am I supposed to make the choice of making ends meet at the end of the month and or paying for my prescription drugs? That is a choice that no Coloradan should have to face. No one should have to ration the life-saving drugs that they need in order to make sure that there's food on the table, to make sure that their kids have new clothes, to make sure that they can just live their life. No one, everyone respects the innovations that are within the pharmaceutical industry, not only here in Colorado and in biosciences, but also across the country. There is hopefully bipartisan support for pharmaceutical transparency, making sure that we have a good understanding of when certain drugs their prices are going up by a certain amount. We should be able to collect that information so that consumers have it. We need to empower consumers to better understand why it is that some drugs are going up this much and why some are not. There are other states that have had conversations that go even further about on the highest cost drugs, not the vast majority, but on the highest cost drugs, what can we do to help make sure that those drugs are affordable to the people who actually need them? So there have been states that have looked at creating an affordable prescription drug board to take a look at that very small percentage. I think you're going to see the legislature continue to have conversations this year about how do we save people money on healthcare? How do we make sure that they don't have to make those impossible decisions, while at the same time, obviously, all recognizing where our innovation is better than other countries and lifting that up.
Just to point out that our chat function is not just there for show. Adeline has been persistent and we'll get her question asked, which I think Representative McKean has kind of addressed in the chat. So we'll go straight to you with the answer, Minority Leader. Young people are officially the largest voting bloc in the country and turned out in record numbers during the November 2020 election. It's clear that young people have a lot of power, but are often left out of the political conversations. What are you doing to make sure that young people have a seat at the table, and how are you planning to learn about and prioritize the issues that affect young people the most?
Well, and what I answered in the chat was that I'm the chair of the Colorado Youth Advisory Council, and that is something that I inherited from people who went before me. In fact, Ellen Roberts from down in Durango started that, and what it was a way to get the voices of young people to the legislature so that their ideas for what would improve their lives could get a hearing by the people who are able to offer bills and legislation. And the problem was that those kids were showing up at the Capitol in April, long after all our bill deadlines had passed, and saying, hey, here's some great ideas. What can you do about it? And so for one thing, I just thought that was not a great calendar to follow. And so we created an interim committee so that these young people have an ability to come to the legislature, actually be heard. They go out into their communities and scour kids who are engaged for ideas as well. And then they bring them as ideas to this interim committee, and we can bring up to 3 bills on behalf of the youth of the state. And that's a pretty big deal because it gives them direct access to legislators, but also to the process. And then this last year, we actually switched out 2 of the at-large members for members of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe and the Southern Ute tribe, because we had never specifically had members of the Native American community serving on that. And what an interesting voice, right? To bring in that experience and that group of people to this group of kids. And so it's one way, but what I also tell people is that maybe I shouldn't share this, but when 4th graders come to the Capitol and give tours, you will often find me leaving the floor to go on a tour with those kids, partly because you hear amazing things that make you realize that we could do things a better way. And usually when you hear me whistling up into the dome, it's because I'm with a group of 4th graders that really ought to hear how beautiful their Capitol is. But what they're really telling me is what is on their minds and what's on the minds of their families. And I think that we are always open to how those voices get in the building, but I think people need to be encouraged that we want to hear them.
If I could just jump in, Marshall, real quick, it's such an important question. And House District 2, I am proud to say, is the youngest House District based on average age of voter. And though I'm coming towards the end of my term, if you play with your Zoom filter, it makes you look a little bit younger than maybe at the beginning of my term. But
There's a Zoom filter?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There, don't get caught in like that cat video. But I don't know, it's such an important question because I got started because I had access to the halls of power in the US Congress by just being an intern. And so, what I've encouraged all of our new members to do is even if it's remotely at the moment, but make sure that you are reaching out to high school seniors, you're reaching out to college students to provide access to internships in your office to understand how the legislative process works. Because as soon as you understand, okay, this is what it takes to be an aide, this is what it takes to be on a policy team for one of the caucuses, this is how I can actually run for office, you can start to think through and plan for those big changes in your life. And even if you decide you're not going to be the one who runs for office, you know that people are accessible, that this is how you get in touch with your legislator, your state senator, and this is how you can create change. It's so important. But for all of us, our responsibility is to keep that door open, to continue to invite young people in, to make sure that they have access, that they're ready to lead, because you are the next generation. You are going to help Colorado continue to be the best state in the union. So thanks so much for the question.
We've got a question from Kristen Strum, my friend Kristen Strum, who's the president and CEO of the Common Sense Institute. And she wants to ask about the public option.
Thank you to 9 News, to Joey, for hosting this important discussion today. My name is Kristen Strum, President and CEO of the Common Sense Institute. Since the start of the pandemic, Common Sense Institute has been analyzing trends across the Colorado workforce and discovered something shocking. We are in the middle of a she-cession, and there is a huge gender gap in the economic impacts of the pandemic, with more than twice as many Colorado women being forced out of the workforce than men, and 1 in 10 working mothers having to leave the workforce in Colorado altogether. Colorado is laser focused on economic recovery, but we cannot recover if we don't get women back to work. To be clear, a generation of progress for women in the workplace in Colorado could be reversed if we don't take immediate action to understand and ultimately solve this problem. That means finding solutions to issues like childcare and education. My question to legislators: What are your plans to support women and get us back to work?
Representative Garnett, what do you think of that?
Oh, it's such an important point by Kristen. And Kristen, thanks so much for raising it. Emily, my wife, and I were talking about this just yesterday. I don't know if the numbers were national or specific to the state, but literally the least number of women in the workforce in the past 30 years because of what this pandemic has done. I have two kiddos. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and the pressures from childcare that it placed on our household, especially in the months between March and July, were astounding. And what I found was the way that our household reacted to it was probably a little bit more balanced than most, but still a lot of the burden fell on Emily's shoulders because we were in temporary adjournment from the legislature, but I'm in my 2-year-old daughter's bedroom right now. I was on this Zoom account literally from 8 in the morning till 5 o'clock at night on Zoom after Zoom, thinking through how we were going to get the state up and going again. And it was applying unbelievable amounts of pressure on Emily. Clearly, we have to make sure to do more around childcare and making sure there's access to childcare. Luckily, our kids were able to go back to their childcare center in July, but that's not the case for so many parents. So that's why you saw bipartisan support for what we did in special session to come in and provide more operational dollars to childcare to make sure that they could open, that they had more money to pay for cleaning supplies and cleaning crews to come in to make sure that their environments were safe, so that parents had a safe place to drop off their kids so that they could go back to work, they could continue to make a living, but there's still more work to be done. It's less at the moment on making sure that there's operational dollars for the existing childcare centers, but actually figuring out ways to increase access to childcare. There are waiting lists all over the metro area and in different rural spots in particular across the state. We need to do more to get one-time dollars into those communities to open up more childcare centers so that parents feel safe and comfortable dropping off their kids and women get back in the workplace. It's unacceptable. It's a huge tragedy of this pandemic, and it's got to be at the top of our priority list.
Well, Representative McKean, you like women. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I think that Speaker Garnett started this well, which is to say that what we saw was a dynamic change in how families work. And one of the biggest things that we really need to look at as well is what support can we give school districts to make sure that we open for in-person school. And this is something I don't think that people really realize, is that you have parents who are telecommuting from home, who are also trying to help their kids do online school, who during the days when it's either a late start Wednesday or an early release Friday or whatever else it is, trying to figure out how to get the kids to all the things that they used to do as a normal function of their commute back and forth to work. We have created, and I shouldn't say we have created, I think the circumstances of COVID have created one of these terrible perfect storms for families. And so now you have families who are trying to knit together what they need to do. And it is the most stressful thing that I think we have ever seen, because as Speaker Garnett said, a lot of that load got burdened on Emily, who is one of the most delightful, wonderful people I've ever known and can handle that burden. But I will tell you that I'm talking to other families who, when schools came back in person and then went back remote, and how much interaction there is with kids online with their instructors and their teachers, and then how much are they supposed to do independently. This has really strained the ability of our families and our kids to the absolute limit. And so what we can do to help schools come back in person, what we can do to help the child care issues, we have been working in a bipartisan way on all of those things, and we'll continue to do so.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question. Public option. What's the Republican caucus position on the public option? Either one of you.
Well, Julie, I'll jump in. Public option, apparently some people think that sounds interesting, appealing. What public option means, in my opinion, is government control of you. It's citizen control. Those who would be in that plan, if it were to exist, would have limited options. Your doctor would have limited options as to what he or she could do for you, and there would be price controls limiting how much he or she could charge. that this is very frustrating for me, because I think the reason that healthcare is so frustratingly expensive is the government is too involved in health insurance and healthcare. I would like to see more of a free market there, and less requirements, less restrictions on what health insurance companies must do or can't do, and also healthcare providers. That is what I'm describing as the opposite of what we have now. And as we continue to put more controls on people, both patients, customers of health insurance companies, patients of doctors, and controls on doctors and hospitals, we can only expect the inevitable result of having more government controls is it will be more expensive. The government doesn't make things like that less expensive.
I'll chime in, and then I've got to go because I have a 12:30. But what I will share with you is that I think that this is a really, really critical discussion that we've got to be incredibly careful about. So if you go back a year and you think about family leave and the discussion around family leave in the legislature, that was going to be a $2.4 billion program. $2.4 billion collected to deliver $1 billion worth of assistance for people who needed to take time off. Now, just step back for a second and think about what that means. That means that you're going to spend more than half of your money to administrate the program. That's partly why some of us have tight reins on government, because we think that that's often a problem with bureaucracy, is that you create a huge organization to do the thing you want to do. I think that the challenge that we have with public option is that there has never been a more critical time to really look at what would the effect be, because we don't live in a state, unlike the federal government who can print money, we don't live in a state where we have unlimited resources. And so if what we're going to do is create a system of a public option that then depends on the state to pay some of those bills, well, now we're competing with education. We're competing with all of the other costs that we have to go about and do our business. And I think that that's a very, very sticky wicket, because when we get into this, often we make a change. It's very hard to unmake. And so how do you unring this bell after some people will probably leave the market, and some consumers will be left with only the state. And then what if there are financial decisions the state has to make that put that healthcare in jeopardy? So in the end, it's not as easy as just to say, yeah, we ought to do this. It's what can we do? How can we look at that? I mentioned to somebody yesterday about how well can we, if they do put this 2-year test period in, how can we make sure that we come back with a very in-depth study at the end of that before we automatically go to something that state offers? I think that that's our responsibility, and I would ask for some bipartisan help on that. And I have to go, but thank you guys so much for putting this together.
Minority Leader, if you dig through the insulation long enough, you'll eventually reach the outside, and we will get you to help you.
Let me just jump and thanks. I'm also going to have to jump, but this has been a great conversation, and it really is an honor to be on with Minority Leader Holbert and Minority Leader McKean, though I don't have to say that since he jumped. Minority Leader McKean was starting to talk about family medical leave. Let's be careful, right? The people of Colorado passed that by an overwhelming majority. There was like a 15% passed by a 15-point margin at the ballot. That's because there was frustration that the Colorado legislature couldn't come together and deliver on a benefit that clearly a vast majority of the people across the state wanted. Now, there's a lot of ideas that we're just bouncing back and forth that have nothing to do with the current conversation about public option. I think it's important for people to know that first, that like 77% of Coloradans in a recent poll that I saw want the legislature to focus on saving people money on healthcare. Please, 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 the status quo is not working. Please help us save money on healthcare, because it's taking up too big of a portion of our family budget, of our small businesses budget to survive. And we're seeing double-digit increases time, year after year after year. So what you're going to see is a conversation about how can we bring everyone to the table, and everyone agrees, depending on who within the healthcare industry you're talking to, whether or not you're talking to the hospitals or the insurance companies, everyone points the finger at somebody else and says, yeah, we agree healthcare costs are going up too much, but it's not our fault, it's their fault. Well, if that's the case, let's come to the table. Let's all agree on some way of moving forward on behalf of the people of Colorado, because the status quo clearly isn't working. Thank you guys so much for having me on. It really has been a pleasure. And I look forward to, obviously seeing everybody in person or remotely soon.
Speaker, if you can slow play that real quick, because I think you're going to want, I want to ask Zoe Barley's question from the chat, which is very important because it points to a problem we have in this panel. I see Senator Holbert, or Chris Holbert, Alec Garnett, Hugh McKean. It was supposed to be Leroy Garcia, but it was Stephen Fenberg, something that all of you have in common, including me and Joey. We're all men. The question from Zoe: what tangible material solutions can women of color and their families expect from Colorado's state leadership?
Yeah, listen, I don't hide from my the fact that I'm a straight white guy. We have the most that you can, one, rest assured it's a priority of mine, but two, we have the most diverse House caucus, both primarily on the Democratic side, that we've ever had before. We have our first African immigrant representing a district in Aurora. We have our first Muslim woman representing a district in Aurora. We have a majority women in the state house by a vast majority. The issues on equality and equity are going to be on the forefront of building back Colorado stronger. It's super important. It's important to me, though I know I don't represent women and or a minority group, but it is important to me. Those are the issues that I don't lead on. I help lead from behind on, because it's important that members of those communities champion those issues. It's going to be a top priority for the House caucus. And thanks again so much for having me on.
Thanks for sticking for that question, Senator Holbert.
Well, I look at the Senate, our President Pro Tem now, Senator Kerry Donovan from Vail, the Assistant Majority Leader, Senator Rhonda Fields, proud to work with Rhonda on one of the very first bills that passed this year. It was a bill, a topic that I voted against last year, reauthorizing the regulatory framework around occupational therapists. Senator Fields and I brought that bill during the special session, but it was ruled to be outside the governor's call. And we agreed to work together to get that bill done in the first 3 days of this session. I just encourage the lady who offered the question, or all participants, look at the performance of your state legislature. Please differentiate it from Congress in Washington, D.C. None of us are members of that body, and none of them are members here. We work with a governor, a chief executive by the name of Jared Polis, not former President Trump or current President Biden. We have a unique state constitution that requires us to work together. And the most important bill we have every year, the one bill that we're required to pass, is the state budget. It has to be balanced. We can't deficit spend. And I assure you that the finite amount of dollars that we use, we're going to have a lot of conversation about how we can use those best to help as many people in Colorado as possible. That's not because we're better people. I hope we are, but it's because the people of Colorado have given us a constitution that requires it. And it works that way because that's the way the people of Colorado wanted it. And that's the way it's going to work.
I guess you are the winner of the Royal Rumble, Senator.
Still standing.
Hey, so we
the least exciting life. I don't have to drop off.
So we promised our panelists that we'd only go an hour with them. So thank you so much for their time. But, you know, we are going to turn to a conversation now with Joey, Marshall, and Mary Ann, so they can get to perhaps more of your questions and also give some of their thoughts on what to expect for this session.
You know, Linda, we went over, and Scott Wasserman has a great question that might tee up our next conversation if you'd like to play it, and then he'll play us into our post-game entertainment.
All right, I'll do that.
Hi, my name is Scott Wasserman, and I'm president of the Bell Policy Center. You know, one of the things that keeps coming up in our research into economic mobility is inequality. Specifically, here in Colorado, our middle class is both shrinking and becoming more exclusive as paychecks stay flat, public investment is down, and families have trouble affording things like childcare, higher education, and housing. And of course, the virus has made all of this worse. What can our state legislature do to close these gaps and make sure that every Coloradan has an opportunity to live the American dream?
That's a great question. Marshall, what do you think the answer is?
Well, I have a feeling it deals with trust based on the conversations that I was hearing earlier on between Minority Leader McKean and Speaker Garnett. Joey and Marianne, I actually want to bring in Marianne because a lot of what happens at the Capitol, from a TV perspective, for what I do, I show up with my camera, I get the interview I need, and I move on. And that's not when most of this happens. It's happening behind closed doors. It's happening with conversations. It's happening with stakeholder meetings. And I know, Marianne, you know a lot about what goes on there. So to what Scott's asking, like, that's stuff that's happening already and not what's going to happen after February 16th. But I get the impression because it's the meetings that the public never sees that decides what laws and what bills get introduced and what ends up being law.
That's absolutely true, Marshall. We've been reporting, and you have as well, about some of these behind the scenes conversations on just what bills are going to be coming forward in this next legislative session. Virtually everything we've reported on has been the result of extensive stakeholder processes. The one thing that I find intriguing and even a little disturbing is that not everyone who should be at the table is at the table. And we hear a lot about that from those who get left out of these conversations. So it's my hope, at least, that as the process moves forward, and as we get to February 16, it's really important for people to make their opinions heard. Talk to your elected officials, even if they're not from the same party that you're from. They need to hear from you, and they need to hear from you regularly about your concerns. And I know a lot of the folks who are on the call today are people who are engaged, but if you aren't, find out who your elected official is and make your concerns known. Keep in mind the limited power of the legislature. They meet 120 days a year. We don't even know if they're going to go the full 120 days this year. There are things that they can't deal with, things that are going on in Congress, for example. That's not the purview of our elected officials. You also look at the things that are done by the governor, and a lot of the things that he does, the legislature doesn't have a whole lot of say about, although we know those conversations are going on a daily basis. But again, I encourage people, please, please, please talk to your elected officials, talk to your senator, your state senator, your state representatives. Make sure that they're hearing your concerns. That's where legislation comes from.
Well, a lot of it, I think, is definitions. Everybody's for equity. It's just, what is the definition of equity? And people are going to disagree. So, if you have a position, you need to speak up about that position, because the people who have a different position, they may take one step further than you did. Marianne, we had a lot of other questions. What did we not talk about today?
Oh my gosh. First of all, I want to thank everybody for sending in really thoughtful, excellent questions. Some of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, and this was one that was in the chat about student loan debt and helping people with whose debt is with private student loan borrowers and that kind of thing. And I'm going to take a good look at that legislation if that comes forward next week or at some point in the next couple of months on some of those issues. That was a really good question that was submitted by Pauline, and thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it. We had questions about climate change and reconciling the oil and gas industry with what people want to do about climate change. We had a question about whether there's going to be additional Tabor reforms submitted by the voters, submitted to the voters, I'm sorry. Is the session going to get shorter because they're getting a late start? What kinds of healthcare legislation is in the hopper? We had a lot of questions about the isolation experienced by older Coloradans during the pandemic and what kind of mental health issues and mental health legislation might be introduced in order to address some of those questions. Another one on high potency marijuana's impact on mental health. And we have a story coming out this weekend. Pat Pope, our new State House reporter, and I did an extensive look at the issue of high potency marijuana and what that's going to do. There's a bill that is being sponsored by Representative Yadira Caraveo. We took a very deep dive into that, and that'll be coming out this weekend. How will the legislature work to, what kind of steps can it take to strengthen bipartisanship? Another question that I would have loved if we had gotten to is on the cost of public records. That's become a big issue. There's been some pretty steep price increases in certain public records, and what the legislature will do something about.
Well,
another one.
Talk about, I'm sorry to cut you off, but let's talk about what they did talk about. They talked about transportation again, but it felt like they set the table, but they didn't serve the meal because, what are they going to do? We got three ways to pay for transportation. We got the budget, we got borrowing money, bonds, or we've got going to the voters. Did you guys hear an answer to that?
I heard an answer by not an answer. I mean, it's clear they're not going to go to the voters, and you've got the history of going to voters for tax increases that have failed. So I know there's stakeholder meetings going on right now about the idea of fees, which then the story that I'll be covering, which I've already started in a previous story, is the fees that get added perhaps to Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash and all of the delivery options that ends up getting passed to you because they'll change their price structure so that they don't have to pay for that themselves. So in the end, you're paying extra, even if the lawmakers make it seem like that fee is going somewhere else. So perhaps it's explaining to a voter, if we go to you at the ballot, it's going to look like this. If we do it legislatively, it's going to look like this. And it's really going to be no different than if we went to the ballot because you're paying that tax in the end. Or fee. And I know the whole fee, this is the muddiest I think we're ever going to see fee versus tax since Faster happened.
Right. Well, roads aren't paved in asphalt, they're paved in dollars. And I want to know where those dollars are coming from. Mary Ann, what did you hear that you didn't hear with what they said?
I would piggyback on what Marshall said there. I kept waiting for somebody to say, yes, we're going to go to the voters. No, we're not going to go to the voters. I think we got a sort of workaround on the answer to that question. I'm also not sure I heard as much as I would have liked to, and unfortunately, some of that's because some of our panelists had to drop out, and we had agreed to go to 12:30, and so they left when they needed to. On the issue of equity, I appreciate the fact that we have lawmakers coming in. The Representative Judah is coming in, Representative Ricks is coming in, but I'm not hearing enough, I think, on how to move people of color into leadership. Now, the one thing that I will point out is that the Speaker Pro Tem of the House is Adrienne Benavides, a Latina. The Majority Leader is Danea Esgar, who is from the LGBT community. So they're moving in that direction, but Esgar's term limited. She won't be there in the session after that. So she's not going to have the opportunity to move into the speaker's chair, which is sort of a traditional way these things happen. So, I'm curious to see how the House Democratic Caucus in particular moves in that direction, how they make that happen. And make sure those opportunities continue, especially when you have women dominating the Democratic caucus in both the House and Senate. But they're not in those top leadership positions, and whether they're being groomed or whether people are being groomed for that in the future, we'll have to wait and see.
Let me throw one last thing on the table. I would have liked to have heard more specifics on the public option. I thought Kristen Strum had a great question, and then nobody wanted to answer it. They went with the she session part of the question, and I tried to pull them back to the public option, but I still don't know what the answer was. What did you hear, Marshall, on the public option? You think that's going to pass?
That was probably the most confusing part of what I was listening to, because I wasn't sure what the answer really was. I mean, I work in yes and no's, and let's stay on point. I know it's a little difficult in the Zoom to hang on. You're not really addressing it because there were other questions where they ended up coming back to the topic. So I mean, I don't know that I got this from the answers, but it's a tough sell right now because, money.
Yeah.
You got to come to the table at the legislature for the next couple of years with minimal cost options. And the ones that are going to cost are clearly going to be from the Democratic side. And then they have to prioritize which of those they want. It just like, you have to look at the math, and I don't think the math is there to even, I don't know if it's there to attempt it right now. And if it is, then you have to justify when the budget people are saying the next 2 years are dire, and then you're coming to the table with, well, this thing's going to cost so much over a decade, will end up being okay after a decade. Like, it's just a tough sell with weird math.
Yeah, so I guess maybe I didn't hear an answer because there isn't one. Guys, I can't think of anything else we didn't talk about. Linda, did you have something you think we should kick around?
There are going to be so many opportunities. I'm hoping that we can continue to have these kinds of conversations in the future, that let's go ahead and end it there. So, again, I want to thank you three for your insightful questions and for, putting this all together. I want to thank everyone who submitted a question. And obviously, this is something we'll be talking about for the next few weeks as the legislature gets started on Tuesday. So you can find all of our coverage for the session at coloradopolitics.com and on 9 News, and also on our sister publication, denvergazette.com. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a safe and warm weekend. Thanks, everyone.